Welcome back to Gimel series, where I introduce theories of management, administration, and leadership. This is episode 49. In this video, I'll introduce a construct, employee voice. Employee voice refers to employees speaking up with ideas, concerns, and opinions intended to improve their organization. Voice is a discretionary behavior. It is not mandated by one's formal role, but rather an actual role or voluntary action motivated by constructive intent. An employee exercising voice offers suggestions or critiques to help the organization, not simply to complain. Morrison integrated past work into a concise definition. Voice is a discretionary communication of ideas, suggestions, concerns, or opinions about work-related issues with the intent to improve organizational or unit functioning. This definition highlights that true voice is informal, optional, change-oriented, which aims to benefit the work unit or organization. The construct of voice in organizations has evolved over time. It traces back to Albert Hirschman's economic theory of exit or voice, where voice was seen as an alternative to exiting a dissatisfying situation by actively trying to improve it. In the 1980s, industrial relations scholars applied employee voice to mean mechanisms for employees to have a say, for example, union representation or suggestion schemes. However, in organizational behavior research, voice was later conceptualized more specifically as an individual discretionary behavior. A key milestone was the seminal study by Van Dyne and Lapine in 1998, who formally identified voice as a distinct type of actual role behavior. They defined voice as a form of constructive, change-oriented communication, such as making innovative suggestions for change and recommending changes to standard procedures even when others disagree. This work provided evidence that voice was a unique construct. It's different from other actual role behaviors like simple helping. For example, employees who spoke constructively helped to improve group performance. Following this, the early 2000s research expanded our understanding of voice. Researchers recognized that not only speaking up, which is a voice, but also withholding ideas, which is a silence, deserved attention. Van Dyne and colleagues, for example, contrasted voice expressing ideas with deliberate silence and highlighted that choosing not to speak up can stem from resignation or fear. Around the same time, Morris and Millikan described how many organizations develop climates of silence, where employees collectively refrain from voice due to fear of negative consequences. Those works shifted focus to the conditions that suppress voice and emphasized that employee silence is the problematic flip side of voice behavior. Another landmark study was Deterred and Burris' 2007 field study showing that leader behavior influences employee voice. Employees were more likely to speak up with improvement-oriented ideas when they perceived their managers open and supportive. This underscored voice as not just an individual disposition, but a behavior shaped by the context, for example, leadership and culture. In the late 2000s, researchers also examined cultural differences, for example, whether high-power distance cultures inhibit voice. In cultures where hierarchy is highly respected, employees voice ideas less unless they have very high trust in their leader. Those studies demonstrated that voice expression can vary widely across contexts and populations. A theoretical development of employee voice took a major step in an article titled Psychological Antecedents of Promotive and Prohibitive Voice, a two-wave examination, published in Academy of Management Journal in 2012. In this article, the authors argue that a voice is not a unitary construct, but has at least two distinct forms, promotive and prohibitive voice. Promotive voice refers to employees' expression of new ideas or suggestions for improving the overall functioning of their work unit or organization, essentially speaking up to advance the organization. By contrast, prohibitive voice refers to employees' expression of concern about work practices, incidents, or employee behavior that are harmful to the organization, speaking up to avert problems. This study was a key milestone that opened up a multidimensional view of voice. It showed that the two types have different psychological antecedents and possibly distinct outcomes. This study inspired subsequent research to consider content and motive of voice, improvement-oriented or prevention-oriented. Recently, scholars have further refined the employee voice construct. Mace and Podskov responded to lingering theoretical confusion by providing an even more nuanced framework of voice behavior. They argue that prior work sometimes modeled different constructs. They identified 4 voice types along 2 dimensions: challenging versus supporting the status quo, and constructive promotive versus destructive and prohibitive intent. Specifically, the differentiated supportive voice, which refers to defending worthwhile current practice, and constructive voice, which refers to challenging the status quo with positive suggestions. Defensive voice, which refers to opposing changes and preferring to preserve status quo if changes seem harmful. And the destructive voice, which refers to expressing criticism or objections that are harmful or unproductive. This expanded taxonomy addressed the theoretical ambiguity and provided tailored measures for each type. The recent development in the evolution of employee voice research indicates the field's move toward greater clarity about what counts as voice. From an operational standpoint, employee voice is typically measured via surveys or observations of how frequently individuals speak up with constructive input. Voice behavior scales as respondents rate statements reflecting speaking out. For example, a promotive voice survey item may state, "This employee proactively develops and makes suggestions for issues that may influence the unit." A prohibitive voice survey item is, "This employee speaks up honestly with problems that may cause serious loss to the work unit, even when dissenting opinion exists." Those survey items capture the 2 key facets of voice content: proposing improvements and warning about threats. In practice, if a nurse notices a way to streamline patient check-in and suggests that change, then it is a promotive voice. If another employee notices an unsafe procedure and raises that issues to prevent an accident, that is prohibitive voice. Both include employees' expression of constructive suggestions or concerns, but the promotive voice focuses on realizing opportunities for improvement, whereas prohibitive voice focuses on stopping or fixing problematic practices. Why do employees decide to speak up or stay silent? There are at least 4 psychological and organizational mechanisms that drive voice behavior. A fundamental mechanism is the feeling of safety in speaking one's mind. Psychological safety is the shared belief that one can voice ideas or concerns without fear of punishment or ridicule. When employees feel psychologically safe, they are empowered to express ideas freely without fear of retaliation. Edmondson's classic work showed that teams perform better when members feel safe to discuss errors or controversial ideas openly rather than holding back. In a safe environment, an employee who spots a problem is more likely to raise it and trust that management and administration will not shoot the messenger. By contrast, if voicing concern is met with hostility or reprimand, a climate of silence emerges. Employees carefully scan their environment for cues about whether speaking up is welcome. If past attempts at voice were snubbed or met with defensiveness, employees learn to stay quiet to avoid negative outcomes. As a result, psychological safety or its absence is a powerful driver of voice behavior. Leaders heavily influence this mechanism. Supportive, open leaders cultivate safety, whereas punitive or authoritarian leaders breed fear that silences employees. Many employees speak up because they feel a personal responsibility to fix problems or improve the workplace. This internal sense of duty has been termed a felt responsibility or felt obligation for constructive change. It is essentially a pro-social motivation, which means the individual feels accountable for making things better. Employees who feel more responsible for influencing changes are more likely to take charge and voice suggestions for improvement. In practice, an employee with high felt obligation say, if I see something wrong or a way to improve, I have to speak up. It is my duty to the organization. This internalized obligation can be nurtured by organizational culture. For example, a mission-driven culture where improvement is everyone's responsibility, and by seeing others voice ideas. When team members actively speak up, it can instill a similar obligation in others to contribute, which is a social contagion effect. Felt obligation tends to motivate especially promotive voice, which means suggesting new ideas and improvements as people channel their sense of responsibility into constructive proposals. Another lens to explain employee voice is social exchange theory. We've already discussed this theory in a previous video. According to social exchange theory, employees weigh the reciprocity in their relationship with the organization or leader when deciding whether to voice. Voice is associated with some risk and extra effort. So employees are more inclined to speak up if they feel valued and supported. Essentially, if I'm treated well, I owe the organization my ideas. High quality leader-member exchange and organizational support generate trust that management will reciprocate the gesture of voice with appreciation rather than punishment. Ethical leadership, which means leaders who are fair, caring, principled, has been found to promote employees' voice behaviors through enhanced leader-member exchange, which in turn boosts employees' feeling of psychological safety. In those cases, a trusting, mutually respectful relationship, which is a positive social exchange, leads employees to reciprocate by sharing suggestions or concerns. More broadly, when employees perceive strong support from their supervisor or colleagues, they feel an urge to give back by contributing ideas. But if an employee senses that the organization is indifferent or untrustworthy, for example, previous suggestions fell on deaf ears or led to retaliation, they withdraw and withhold their voice as a form of exchange equilibrium. So voice can be seen as a part of reciprocal exchange. It flourishes in the context of trust, support, and fair treatment, and diminishes when those conditions are absent. Voice is inherently a proactive behavior, often driven by the individual's initiative and confidence. Proactive behavior theories suggest that employees need certain motivational states to engage in proactive acts like voice. A key factor is psychological empowerment and efficacy, which is the belief that when can influence change. Employees who feel competent and believe their voice will make a difference are far more likely to speak up. Voice is associated with traits like proactive personality and with feelings of empowerment, which means having control or influence in one's role. Another factor is having a future-oriented mindset, which means seeing a better way things could be. Voice often requires envisioning improvements, which is a future state, and working to bring it about. An employee high in proactive personality may habitually scan for problems or opportunities and speak up to address them without being asked. Moreover, Self-efficacy, which means confident in ability to speak up on work issues, is important. If employees lack confidence in their communication skills or fear they won't be taken seriously, they are unlikely to voice. These 4 mechanisms often work in combination. Consider an employee in a supportive team. She feels safe, no fear of punishment, seeing colleagues sharing ideas, which forms the norm that gives her a sense of obligation to contribute. She also has a good relationship with her supervisor, which is reciprocal trust, and prides herself on being proactive. All those forces together create a strong impetus for her to voice concerns or suggestions. By contrast, if any of those forces turn negative, say the supervisor is punitive, which undermines safety and social exchange, or the employee is generally passive, which is low proactive motivation, then voice is stifled. So understanding those underlying drivers is important for leaders who wish to encourage employee voice. Encouraging employee voice is actually a very delicate task for leaders and administrators. In practice, leaders act as the gatekeepers of voice. Leaders' behavior can either open the door for constructive input or firmly shut it. To promote voice, effective leaders cultivate an environment where speaking up is welcomed and valued. But in reality, many leadership behavior, intentional or not, can suppress employee voice. It's the leader who proclaims an open-door policy, but then reacts poorly when someone actually raises a problematic issue. For example, when a team member cautiously brings up a customer complaint pattern, an administrator responds with visible annoyance or a defensive comment like, "We've already tried that, just stick to the plan." This reaction sends a chilling effect through the entire team, which is a signal that honesty is naturally welcome. Over time, employees choose silence over voice, especially for anything that may challenge the status quo or question leadership decisions. Organizational policies can also unintentionally stifle voice. Highly bureaucratic procedures for submitting suggestions or a strictly top-down decision process communicate that input from lower levels of the hierarchy is not valued. Similarly, workload and time pressures can suppress voice. If employees are barely coping with heavy work demands, they may not have the cognitive or emotional bandwidth to speak up about improvements. Leaders sometimes face dilemmas regarding voice in decision-making. One dilemma is balancing voice and authority. Although inviting employees in decision, which is seeking their voice, can improve buy-in and yield valuable insights, it can also blur who is accountable. One administrator may wonder, if I ask for everyone's input on this issue, what if it conflicts with what I believe is right? Do I follow their voice or my own expertise? There is also the challenge of filtering voice. Not every ideal employee's voice will be feasible or aligned with organizational goals. Leaders must decide which voice ideas to act on. Ignoring too many can demotivate employees, but acting on every suggestion is simply impractical. So a savvy leader will acknowledge all voices, implement the best, and explain why others cannot be pursued at this time, and maintaining trust that speaking up is still valued even if it doesn't always lead to change. Although the value of employee voice is widely recognized, researchers have also raised criticism. One of them is whether employee voice is inherently constructive or if it can be negative or harmful. Early definitions, as we saw, built in a constructive intent. Voice was defined as aiming to improve the organization. This means, theoretically, if an employee is just venting or maliciously complaining, that would not count as true voice behavior. However, in practice, employees may speak up in ways that management finds annoying or even detrimental. For example, persistent criticism without solutions. Some researchers argue that those behaviors should still be studied under the voice umbrella, even if they are negative voice, because they're instances of employees attempting to be heard. The expanded voice typology includes destructive voice to capture this, speaking with hurtful, debasing, or non-constructive comments about policies or people. The inclusion of destructive voice acknowledges that not all upward communication is beneficial. Some can be counterproductive and stem from cynicism rather than desire to help. A related point of contention is the outcomes of voice. Generally, voice is thought to benefit organizations, such as improving decision quality and flagging issues early, and indeed, many studies link voice to higher team performance and innovation. But there can be a dark side. Voice can consume time, create conflict, or be perceived as insubordination by insecure supervisors. So more voice is not automatically better in every situation. Quality, context, and management of voice matter. In closing, employee voice represents the heart of a learning organization. It is how individuals participate in collective progress. A leader or administrator should view voice not as a threat to authority, but as an important source for decision-making. There is a saying, the most expensive problems in our organization are the ones we don't know about yet. Employee voice is how you find out those problems and the great ideas you didn't know about. It is your job as a leader or administrator to create an environment where employees feel free and obligated to speak up. The challenge and opportunity for you is to create conditions where that voice flourishes in service of constructive change.